Go ahead and start as we've been doing with just the one prayer before the teaching, the refuge prayer that's on the first page. Does everyone have a copy of the prayers or can share one? So again, just to reiterate what we're doing with this prayer, all of our Buddhist prayers are really simply about entertaining particular thoughts. In this case, two thoughts that we're trying to cultivate. The first one is refuge, which another term for this, actually, the teacher Alex Berzin likes to call this safe direction, kind of where we are finding safe direction in our lives. And there are many teachings you can find safe direction in. This is the first two lines of this verse are just asserting if you feel some inclination towards the Buddha's teachings, the Dharma, as well as the Buddha who taught them, and then the Sangha, the Supreme Assembly that practiced them, you can recite it with those thoughts. But if you have other things you place your refuge in that you find safe direction in, you can think about those as well as we recite that first part of the verse. The second part of the verse is something we're going to meditate on as well a little bit, which is the motivation why we're here. And ideally why we want to be here is with the most far-reaching attitude, the idea that we each have the potential to achieve complete Buddhahood. So we're here to listen to the Dharma, listen to the teachings of the Buddha, so we can eventually achieve that goal. And then in that way, as it says there, benefit all transmigratory beings, all the beings who are caught up in the same pattern that we are in, going from life to life and so on. We'll talk about this a little bit tonight. So let's just recite this twice in English as we've been doing, and then once in the Tibetan. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my merits of listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my merits of listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. Sangye chodam soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki chenyen gipe sonam gi Drola penchir sangye drupar sho. Okay, good. You can set the prayers aside then, and we'll just start with a short meditation. Give ourselves a chance to let go of any distractions we might have in our minds. Try to be here in a bit more present and focused way. So again, in doing meditation, just find a place where the back is naturally upright. If you're sitting on a cushion, you can just find a comfortable place for the legs. If you're sitting in a chair, it's good if you can have the legs flat or with the feet flat on the ground in front of you, but whatever is comfortable for you. So then with the back straight, the hand should be in ideally this posture, this meditation posture, where the palms are up, the right on top of the left, with the thumbs just gently touching, and this just kind of cradled in your lap. But if it's more comfortable to have your hands on your knees or wherever in your lap, that's perfectly fine. So the head is upright, just on top of the spine, and we tilt the head forward just slightly, tucking the chin in a bit, and bringing our gaze downward. And it's ideal if you can keep the eyelids very slightly open with a soft focus to the eyes with that downward gaze. But if that's uncomfortable to keep the eyelids open, you're certainly welcome to close the eyes. But do keep in mind that when we close the eyes, that's usually our signal to our body and our minds to go to sleep. So just be a little bit more alert and attentive if you do have your eyes closed to make sure that some tiredness doesn't come into the mind and body. So also we want to relax into this posture. So tonight, to relax, what I'm going to do is another little exercise where we breathe in very deeply. And when you inhale, feel that you're bringing the breath to every single cell in the body. It's as if the entire body is expanding. And then when you breathe out, just kind of allow everything to naturally contract for all of the tension and stress that you feel in the body, even in the mind, to just go out with the exhalation as the body settles into a more relaxed posture. So again, everyone breathes at a different rate, so we'll just give a minute or two to do this on your own, just breathing in very deeply to all of the body, every cell, And breathing out with relaxation, letting go of any stress or tension anywhere in the body or mind. And just do this a couple times. Just allow all the tension to go out of the body. And when you feel that you've gotten into a more relaxed posture, begin to pay attention to the breath. And if you have a technique you already use, you can do that. If not, I'll suggest one that you can work with, and that is to focus on the sensation that occurs as you breathe in and out through the nostrils. Generally towards the tip of the nose, or just on the upper part of that space below the lip, or below the nose, above the lip. Feel the sensation of the air coming in and out of the nostrils. So if you tune into that sensation, you simply make that your meditation object as you breathe in, as you breathe out. Just staying present with that sensation. Trying not to let the mind wander, but nonetheless not making the mind really rigid and tight either. Sometimes I use the analogy of holding an uncooked egg in your hand, in the palm of your hand. You don't want to hold it too tight or the eggshell will break. But you also don't want to become too lax or loose, because then it will fall to the ground and crack. So we simply want to hold our awareness in that way, just as if we're holding an egg in the palm of our hands. Staying focused enough to maintain our awareness, but not getting too tight, not getting too kind of overly focused to where the mind can't maintain that kind of looseness, that relaxation. So the second instruction then, after that, of just simply staying present with the breath, is to pay attention occasionally to see if you're still with the breath. Because no doubt our minds will wander, and when we see that that's happened, there's no need for any judgment. We simply let that go and acknowledge whatever it was that distracted us. We can label it even, but choose not to continue to follow it, not to identify with it. Let it go and go back to the breath, back to that point at the tip of the nose. So let's do this meditation in silence for just a few minutes. Then I'll lead you in a short reflection to explore this topic of working with fear a little bit, and also to set our motivation for being here, to really clarify that in our hearts and minds, so that we have the best results from our work together here tonight. So tonight's subject is working with fear, which is perhaps a bit more difficult emotion to contend with. So I'd like to invite you to begin exploring this in this meditation. And I want you to think about the things that currently bring fear to you. Or if nothing's coming to mind in the moment, something in the recent past that has brought some level of fear. But maybe pick just one or two things to work with. We might have many things that incite some level of fear, some dread, some apprehension. But just choose one or two from those things that you can recall from your recent past or something you know that you're working with currently. And in recalling this fear, the idea is not to instill that in a strong way in our minds right now, but to simply acknowledge it and let's investigate it. I'm just going to pose a few questions to you to take a look at this fear. And first of all, just kind of try to assess where that fear is coming from. There might be many components to it, but don't be satisfied with the most immediate answers. Try to look more deeply to see what's beneath the fear. What thoughts or ideas, concepts, emotions, what is it that is triggering that fear for you? Obviously there's something that you're afraid of. There's always an object of fear. What's underneath the surface? What is it that's causing you to be fearful in regard to that object? I'll just give you a few minutes to investigate that and see what answers you come up with for yourself as to why that fear is arising. What's behind the process? And the second thing I'd like you to investigate is the idea that perhaps there's something we can learn from fear. So we've looked already at some of what's behind that fear arising. Hopefully you've come up with some things that will be a part of that answer. So here we're more looking at, what are the things that we can begin to take away from that fear, that can improve us as individuals, can maybe strengthen our wisdom, our compassion, our love. Does that feel like a possibility? And if so, what would that look like? To learn from that fear, to embrace that fear, to even invite that fear into our lives. So So just play with that idea for the next couple minutes and see what answers come up when you begin to look at fear in that light. What you could learn from it. Is it possible to learn from that fear, to grow, to develop? Or does it feel like something that is entirely kind of negative, entirely in that vein? And then to move this into setting our motivation, to try to entertain thoughts such as, I'm here tonight to get to know fear better, to try to explore this emotion that myself and all beings experience to some degree. But I'm going to do this for my own welfare, of course, so I can benefit, so I can be more embracing of that fear that arises in my mind. But moreover, so that I can help all beings to work with their fear, to learn from their fear, and eventually for all of us to achieve the fearless state, the state of Buddhahood, where we will no longer have to experience any of that, because we will have removed all the causes that lead to fear. And just hold that thought for being here tonight. And then we can open our eyes fully, and we'll explore this a bit more. So, this topic of fear, this is one I added to the list a few years ago because I was invited by the Vipassana Sangha in Santa Fe. Most of you know what a Vipassana tradition is. It's one of the Buddhist branches of practice that's primarily, they do tend to work with teachings in various veins, but they also have a lot of emphasis on meditation. They're probably one of the larger segments of Buddhism in this country, at least. And they've got a group in Santa Fe that meets in the... I've gone there a couple of times to teach, and the one woman who was in charge of putting together the teaching topics and working with the teachers suggested this topic, and this is what she said to me in her email when she wrote to me about this. This was about a little over 2 years ago. She said, what do you think about the issue of fear and the subtle and not so subtle role that it plays in our lives? And she says, I think it's fascinating on a personal level, nationally and internationally. Fear and the creation of fear seems to greatly influence the way things are being played out in our society. For example, with personal safety, immigration, terrorism, militarism, and so on. It's also a subject that doesn't get discussed very often, and I find this to be quite true, is that it's not something that we touch on that often. Nonetheless, fear does play some role in our Buddhist practice, and we'll be talking about that tonight. So that was the idea behind doing this, is to really begin to explore this topic a little bit more and see where fear comes from. What I find quite interesting, because I have done a bit of the more kind of traditional studies that they do in the monasteries in Tibetan Buddhism, at least, these studies that are about creating what are called geshes. You all had Geshe Sherab here earlier this year. Geshe Tenlei is coming a little bit later this year. A geshe is a title that they give to a monastic, and now it's both monks and nuns, who complete the full level of studies of these various texts and pass all the exams, and they do all these debates. You might have seen videotapes of them doing debates out in the debate yard. It's really quite animated, and anyway, it takes many years to complete these studies, but so I haven't done that level of study. I'm nowhere near the level of study that a geshe has done. But one of the texts that they study in becoming a geshe is this text that's called Lorik. Lorik in Tibetan means kind of minds and awarenesses. Those are kind of equivalent at some level, but we're talking about kind of the whole sphere of our mental experience. And in that course, you actually look at one big word, which is epistemology. Epistemology is how the mind knows. So you come to understand how it is that we, see a flower or know impermanence or any of these ideas that we're putting out there, kind of how the mind functions at that level. And I'm not going to talk about that tonight. That's a big topic. But what I'm going to talk about is a bit of Buddhist psychology, which is the other component of Lo-Rik. And in Buddhist psychology, they set out kind of the mind itself as the sort of sphere in which all of this is happening. And then they delineate all these various, what are called mental factors. It's just one way of kind of looking at the landscape of our minds and picking out, well, what's going on in particular states of mind. And so they delineated 6 groups that constitute a total of 51 mental factors. But it's not meant to be exhaustive in the least. And what's interesting is fear is actually nowhere in that list. And I found that kind of really curious. And there's a few other things that are kind of missing from the list. But the list is definitely devised as some means of looking at our minds with some aim of trying to understand the Buddhist way of working with our minds. So nonetheless, it's there implicitly to some degree, and that's what we're going to explore first tonight, is kind of what is fear, because there's no traditional definition of fear that comes from the Buddhist text that I could find. But then also, where does fear come from then? If it's not one of these things that's laid out as one factor of the mind, well, what is behind it? What's underneath the surface? A bit of what I invited you to take a look at in the meditation, to see if you could identify from your own state, your own experience with fear, what states of mind are kind of underneath that. If you keep asking the question, well, where is that coming from? And where's that coming from? Anyway, we'll explore that in a moment. Let me just explain to you these 6 categories, because they're kind of interesting just to have some awareness of how the mind is parsed up, what we're looking at in these traditional studies. The very first category is what are called omnipresent, or that's another word for them. This is generally the word omnipresent. These are factors that are always in every state of mind, and you have kind of 5 of them. One of them, I'll just give you an example, is feeling. Feeling here doesn't mean the whole range of emotions. Like when you ask somebody how they're feeling, they might go into a whole litany of all what's happening to them and whether they're sad or happy or whatever. Feeling in Buddhist context is really just kind of the registration of some sort of feeling tone. So when you have something really pleasant come into your life, something enjoyable, it registers a pleasant feeling tone. If you have something that's really painful, difficult, you have a painful feeling tone. But we see how that's a starting point for a whole lot of our emotions, because we get all caught up in the things that are pleasant, and we develop the mind of attachment that we're going to talk about shortly. And then in regard to the unpleasant ones, we generate a whole chain of things that begins with irritation and annoyance and goes to, full-fledged hatred and anger and hostility and so on. So feelings is an important mental factor because it's part of that process of what's registering for us. Of course, there's also neutral feelings that are in the middle that don't really register much of a reaction at all. We have those a good part of our day too. If you need to start paying attention to what's going on with feelings, you can begin to understand that that's the starting point for so much of what we get caught up in or potentially are able to let go of. So that's just one example of the 5 factors that are in that first group, a group of the omnipresent mental factors. There's another group that are called object determining. I'm not going to go into them at length. They're present a lot of the time when the mind is knowing a particular object, particularly an object that we want to engage in more fully. One of them is meditative stabilization, which is what we're trying to do when we're focusing on the breath, right? Is to try to make the mind very concentrated and stable. So it's just giving you an idea of what kind of also helps us to know particular objects, because the mind is always knowing objects, knowing particular things that are appearing to it. Again, by what we mean by mind, just to back up a little bit, is that realm of our experience. It's not anything physical. You have your mind operating every moment. Just sometimes it's subtler, sometimes it's coarser. But mind is in the nature of experience, and it's clear, it's not material. It just has that function of always knowing, always, every moment arising some other object that we're knowing. So, those first 2 categories, those that are present all the time, those that are particularly present when we're getting at an object, knowing an object. Then we have kind of the group that are virtuous or wholesome mental factors. These are kind of the things that the Buddha emphasized that are really good for you to develop. Why? Because they lead to good results. They lead to happiness. They lead to having more peace of mind. So again, they include the opposites of the three main poisons that we're going to look at tonight. Non-attachment, non-anger, non-hatred, non-ignorance. They include a bunch of other mental factors. There's 11 of those that are delineated, but we can't say that that's the extent of our virtuous minds. Many different virtuous minds. Those are just the 11 that are emphasized. Then we have two categories of what are called the afflictions. The afflictions are really important to learn about because, as we're going to explore tonight, these three main ones that we tend to focus on that are included in the first group of afflictions, what are called the root afflictions, they really give us a flavor for why our minds are creating all of our problems, because they're distorted ways of knowing and they relate to things in an inaccurate way. That being out of touch with reality is what's causing us to have all of our problems, the Buddha says. So they're an important category to understand because the first category of the root ones includes those three that are generally the main root ones. It includes another three that are also involved. It also includes the secondary afflictions. The secondary afflictions being all the things that are extensions of those root afflictions. You have things like belligerence and resentment and spite and various things that are just shades of difference in regard to various negative emotions. So that's 5 of the categories then. So you had again the two that are pretty much about knowing things in general, the two that are involved in our unwholesome states of mind, and then finally the virtuous states of mind. The last one is where I'd put fear, if I had to put fear anywhere, and we'll kind of go through this and take a look at why it's in that category. The last category is what we call the changeable mental factors or mental states. Why they're changeable is because they get flavored in a particular way as either being positive or negative, unwholesome or wholesome, on the basis of the thoughts that are accompanying them. So an example of that isn't fear, because we'll look at fear in a moment. An example is regret. So how many of you have regretted something positive that you did? Like you gave money to somebody and then you go, oh, I never should have done that. Now I need that money. Or whatever the case might be. That's an example of a negative regret because it was really good for you to give that money to that person to practice generosity, but you've got this afterthought that makes that regret into something that's kind of undoing that positive act that you did. But we can also regret, obviously, things that we've done that are negative. So if we talk to somebody really harshly and later on in the day we go, wow, that was really unkind of me. I treated that person really poorly. So that's a good regret. That's a positive regret because it makes us feel like we need to rectify things in our lives, that we would take back actions that we did that were negative. So we have a changeable nature to regret. It can go one way or the other depending upon the thoughts that we entertain with that regret. And I'm going to propose that fear is actually one of those same emotions, one of those same parts of our mind that could be changeable depending upon what we're doing and the thoughts that are accompanying it. And I'll get into this shortly because I think it's an important aspect of this, is to really understand that you can have a wholesome sense of fear. In our culture, fear tends to look pretty negative, right? Mm-hmm. And we see it as something that really just even paralyzes us or keeps us from fully engaging in things. And it can have that effect when we accompany certain thoughts with that fear. But it can also be quite positive if we're able to dissect what type of fear we're working with, what it is that we're afraid of, why we're afraid of it, what our response should be. These are all the things we're going to look at tonight, is kind of how do we work with fear? How do we make it something we can learn from? Of course, those of you who've been here the last few nights know that that's pretty much the theme of Buddhism, is that we work with everything. It's all grist for the mill. Buddhism is very much a practice about embracing everything that's in our field of experience and saying, what can we learn from this? And sometimes what we can learn is, that's a valid fear. That's something I should be afraid of. Nothing wrong with that, because we come to understand that there are things that we indeed should be afraid of. Nonetheless, there are also a lot of things that are sort of things we build up through our own exaggeration and imagination that really aren't valid fears at all. But if we don't take the time to look at them, don't take the time to investigate them, we can't really discern what's what frequently, and we just live our lives with this fear compass that keeps pointing us in directions that are really not that useful. So let's talk about what fear is, and then we'll go in a little bit into this idea of where it comes from, and maybe see if people want to share some of what they came up with in their own exploration at the beginning of tonight. Fear could be defined. This is a possible definition. I'll give you one that comes in a more traditional just way that we look at it in the English language, but then I'll also give you one from a Buddhist teacher named Tara Brach, who some of you may have heard of. Fear could be defined as a reaction to something that may happen in the future. Fear is always kind of future-oriented. I think this is an important thing to recognize. You can have fear in the moment, but your fear in the moment is generally still also tied up in what's going to happen from here. You know, so say you're walking down a street at night and you see a dark figure coming at you and become frightened of that person. Who are they? What do they want from me? Are they going to do something to harm me? Even in the face of that fear arising because you're seeing the person there, you still are going through a process of anticipating some sort of event in the future. You're going to keep doing that as long as you're involved in that process of fear. And their fears may be valid, they may not be valid. And we have no way of knowing particularly until that thing happens, but we'll investigate some of the things that could be identified that would lend it being something we should be afraid of versus something we need not fear. Tara Brach, I really like the way she talks about this. She describes fear as the anticipation of future pain. And again, it has that future idea, but she's really talking about, we certainly don't have fear of pleasure, right? You don't have a fear of future pleasure, the anticipation of future pleasure. So this is really getting at the idea that with fear we are definitely talking about something undesirable, something that, so while the first definition is just a reaction to something that may happen in the future, this really does pinpoint it as this is something that we anticipate as being painful. We anticipate some form of suffering we're going to have to experience on the basis of what's going to happen in the future. So we don't want to experience pain. This is a common thing that all beings have. We can see it in animals in this world even, right? No animal wants to experience any pain. No human wants to experience any pain. So this is kind of a driving force that's behind fear, but we'll take a look in a minute about how that gets a little bit out of whack, how our fear can become a bit irrational, and nonetheless how we might be able to still learn from fear or even use fear in a positive way. So the other thing to talk about in regard to when I was pointing out all those groups of things that are going on in the mind, a good share of them, at least the unwholesome states as well as the virtuous states, as well as even the changeable mental factors to some degree, are all involved in what we would call our conceptual mind. That's the other part that, again, I'm not going to talk about much, but the other part of the low-rig study is this epistemology really helps us to understand how does the conceptual mind know things. It's very different from how our five sense consciousnesses know things. So like the color of flowers and the smell of honey, whatever, all these various things that our sense consciousnesses know arise in a very direct way and are just kind of immediately brought into our sphere of awareness. Whereas our conceptual mind is very much one that sort of takes a picture, in a sense, of everything that it's trying to relate to, and then starts working with it in a conceptual framework, not really working with the real object at all, but working with a lot of ideas about that object. So the conceptual mind is where the real laboratory of our Buddhist work is, because our sense consciousnesses aren't the problem. They're just simply portals through which all of this information, all this data is coming in. The fact that we take that data and then we start thinking about it in particular ways is where the problem is. It's also where the solution to the problem is. And that's the wonderful thing about our conceptual minds, is they can cut both ways. They can certainly, create more suffering for us, but they can also undo our suffering by changing how we're thinking about things. So fear in and of itself, I would classify as a conceptual mind. There's a physical component to it, and there's a physical component to many of our states of mind as well. Like when you feel angry, right, there's often the adrenaline pumping through the body and all this feeling kind of rushing up, giving you a physical sensation that goes along with that anger. But nonetheless, we wouldn't say that anger is purely physical. It does trigger particular patterns in the body. Fear does the same thing, right? And we all know there's that fight or flight response that's sort of deeply wired into our physical beings, our bodies, that we can't ignore because it is part of what's going on when fear arises. We're not going to pay much attention to that because that's, again, not the domain of what Buddhism is really working at. Buddhism is helping us to understand what's going on in our minds when fear arises. What is it that perpetuates that process or even strengthens that process so that the fear becomes stronger, fear becomes more pervasive, we can't even, stay standing or keep our composure because the fear has gotten to that degree. So what did you find when you investigated with that question that I prompted you to, take a look at? What was kind of underneath the surface of your fear? Does anyone want to share anything in regard to that? Do you find any answers to that question? Anupama?
Yes. I found that it was the fear of the unknown.
Okay.
Fear of this attachment of the present, that I like so much.
Sure,
the
good.
Control of things, knowing what's happening. So, in one example was that.
Good. That's a good insight. We'll use that, definitely. Anyone else? Anything else that came up for you when you asked that question? What's underneath the surface of that fear? Anyone? Francesco, did you have any?
You fear to have the same result that you have experienced probably in the past.
Okay.
So you are there and you remember something that has happened, and so you...
Okay. And so that's something negative that happened,
Yes.
something painful, and you're projecting it onto
You
the
see
future.
something that is going
Right.
the same way, and so you start
Good.
saying, let's stop here, or...
Exactly, yeah. Because of that kind of aversion to that experience of pain, not having the comfort that we like, but rather having to face that difficulty again, that pain again. Yeah, good. This is also part of it. Anyone else? Any other insights? Yeah, Claudia.
I didn't really, it kind of, I think, ties into Francesco. I had to back into it, I think, but then there was something you said that triggered it. I don't know if you said the antidote or the opposite. There was something that I couldn't break it down this way, but then when you backed into it, I was like, trust. So I guess mistrust, right?
Mistrust,
and I think that's based on past experience,
Sure,
So
sure.
I think you learned that.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good one. That's a good one too. I think these are all things that can be underneath the surface of that. So we don't just see fear as something kind of solid, but we rather see that there's a lot of stuff that's feeding it, that's generating it. Yeah, Cynthia.
I also been thinking that we kind of inherit fears from our family members, the past. And sometimes I say, why? This is not my fear. But I have to have this fear because how come I'm not afraid of that?
Right.
If it's coming from all my lineage of family, karma, past. So I feel a big responsibility to not pass my fear to my children and to other children. That's why I think this is vital for us. We have to stop it.
Yeah. We could call that inherited fear or something.
Something
just kind
like
of,
that, and it's so ingrained in us, in all of us. It's like...
Right. And this is where, again, in any of these scenarios that we're looking at, anything that we sort of pick apart, we find there's so many causes and conditions that are behind it. We can't completely say it's just one thing. And tonight we're going to focus mostly on the one thing that we can change. Kind of, again, going back to the theme that's been running through the past few nights, we can choose to do something different. In the face of our fears arising, we can choose to look at them and think about things in a different way. And in that way, maybe reduce the fear or remove the fear, or we can even acknowledge the fear and do something more beneficial in the moment. So again, this is all these things do condition us, the fear in society at large. There was a wonderful poem I found when I was doing some research on this. This is why, again, I like teaching these things again and again, because every time I teach them anew, or a second time, third time, I go back and do some more research to try to find other pieces and threads that maybe exemplify some of what I've learned about fear myself, but also, what I've learned from talking about fear with others. So there's a poem by a man named Charles Simic. I'd never heard of this poet. Some of you may know poetry more than I do, but he wrote this poem called Fear in 1971. It's very short, and it really kind of exemplifies maybe not as much the inherited thing, but the sort of fear we get by osmosis, by just being in a world around us that is so fearful. He says, "Fear passes from man to man unknowing, as one leaf passes its shudder to another. All at once the whole tree is trembling, and there is no sign of the wind." So it's like, this is what goes on in our society a lot. Is that we just, it's very contagious. Fear is all of a sudden in everybody's minds, and there's no real wind that's shaking the leaves of the tree. Just like there's no potentially, real thing out there that's really triggering it. It just becomes part of our society. And of course, we could go into a whole political aspect of fear, which is, a little bit of what the woman who was inviting me to talk about fear at the Vipassana group was talking about. But I don't know that it's so useful to pick all that apart. It can be a tool for manipulating people, obviously. But again, it's important that we take charge of our own minds and recognize, is this something valid we're buying into, or is it something we're simply inheriting or getting from other people whose fear is quite contagious and so on. Were you going to share something, Paula?
No, I was just thinking that it's so embedded in our kind of routine and in the daily basis, because I think that it's very hard to move away from fear in the ongoing change, right? And as you live every day brings something different for a different reason, right? And then there's so much fear attached, or as a result of that change, which is going to lead eventually to something that you don't know what it looks like. And it comes from, and from that point of view, it's very hard not to live in fear at some point, like during your daily life.
No, this is something we'll explore as well, because I do think that part of the fear is just we're not recognizing the nature of the world around us, that things are constantly changing, that things, that impermanence. And it was quite interesting. Pema Chodron, who I've mentioned a number of times, I really love her teachings. She had one set of teachings where she cited a Time magazine study that actually said that more people, statistically, when they did this particular, it was an article on fear, I guess, when they tested them, they had more fear of uncertainty than they did of their own future pain. Like to be experiencing a surgery or something like that. They just had more fear of uncertainty in general, because uncertainty is what triggers a whole lot of this, right? Because we like things to be certain. We like to have it all under our control. We're control freaks. Whether you consider yourself a control freak or not, we're all control freaks to some degree, because we like it to be our way. We like to know that it's all kind of going to happen the way that we want it to. And when things go out of whack, and I really do feel that a lot of what happened, in 9/11 was people felt like there was no certainty anymore, because all of a sudden anything could happen. Because people had gone on to some degree, even though there were certainly small, tragic, traumatic events that would happen in our country. This was pretty big in terms of something that could be maneuvered to do that kind of harm and create that kind of havoc in the country and terror in people's minds. So it suddenly became like, what do we do with this? This is a whole new world that we're in now, very uncertain. So uncertainty itself is a big part of that trigger for us, of why fear arises. Nonetheless, the Buddha teaches that that is simply a reality of our existence. So we'll look at that when we start undermining fear, or learning from fear, is how do we actually work with that uncertainty? How do we embrace that uncertainty and acknowledge that it's just simply part of the show, and we have to become a little more acclimated to that, a little more used to that.
There is...
Yes, George.
I'd like to share. There is also, the uncertain, of course, is a way of fear. But there is also another one that I couldn't pinpoint what was it. Talking public. For some people, that's fear. People feel really fear of talking in public. It's not uncertain what's going to happen. I mean, you know it's nothing's going to happen. It's just that fear comes up, and I don't know really why. And the other one I did find that is also because of the attachment to our own ideas. If I have an idea and I'm so like I'm going to do it, even if I don't need it, but it's because I wanted to do it, and if it's not happening the way I planned, then I may feel fear about it's not going to happen what I want.
Good.
I think it's because of the attachment that we have to certain ideas.
So let's start to explore this idea of attachment, because I think this is really one of the main emotions that's kind of underneath the surface of this. When the Buddha delineated the 3 root minds or afflictions that are behind all of our problems, I talked about these in this week already, but it's good to revisit these. There's one that is kind of underneath the surface of those other 2, but the 2 main ones that are manifesting, that are more evident in our minds, are those reactions to those 2 feelings. The pleasant feeling of having everything going our way and everything being delightful and delicious and wonderful, and then the unpleasant feeling of pain, suffering, loss, grief, separation, whatever. So we have all of these feelings arising, and we have 2 main ways of reacting to each of these, or one for each of them. Attachment is what happens when we have the pleasant stuff in our lives. And it's pretty natural for attachment to arise. Attachment is a mind that holds the pleasant characteristics and qualities of that object to be kind of supreme and to really be the totality of that object. And even kind of exaggerates them, makes it even more delicious than what is there. Why can we can have some validation of that? Because if you look at any of the things that you're attached to that are sense objects, for example, the music that you like to listen to or the food that you like to eat, you see that not everybody has that same experience of those things, right? I like music as an example because everyone generally has some pretty different tastes in music. And if you hear somebody coming by in a car with music that you don't like blaring through their speakers, right, with the boom, 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 or whatever, and you're just like going, God, how can they listen to that music? You're hearing that music as something negative, but what's happening for them, they're hearing it only as positive. So they're blind to anyone else hearing it as negative because they're quite happy listening to that music. And you do the same thing with the music you like. You can really enjoy it and play it all the time, and people around you are like, why are they listening to that music? So music's a good example, but food even. Not everybody likes the same food. Not everybody likes the same colors of clothing. Not everybody likes the same environment. Why do people live in different parts of the country? Because they like different places to live. They're attached to different things. So anybody who is attached to something is seeing that as kind of like, that's perfect. That's got everything that I'm looking for, and exaggerates those qualities and grabs at them as if we don't want to be separated from that. This is the nature of the mind of attachment. It's like pulling things towards us and not wanting anyone to take them away from us, or not wanting that experience to end. And that's why attachment is so painful, is because inevitably those things are going to end. Those things are going to change. They go in and out of our lives, and they don't even have the qualities that we think that they do. And they certainly don't have them to the degree that we think that they do. For us, and this is where we'll put a little bit in here about karma, because we are going to talk about karma later as well as one of the understandings we can take away from this. But karma even plays a role in what we do find pleasant and what we find unpleasant. We have particular what we call karmic appearances. Karma being, again, the law of cause and effect that governs our experiences. All of our experiences arising from what we've done with our mind in the past, that informs what we experience now in the present and beyond. So the things that you have in your life that cause you to be quite attached to those people and have those pleasant experiences, or those objects of desire or what have you, to have those kinds of experiences is karmically conditioned. Why do you meet a particular person and feel really attracted to them and feel like you want them in your life and so on? There's some sort of karmic propensity there that's driving you in that way. And you kind of hope that it's there from the other side as well, and that you can make that work or something. But it's really just a karmic appearance, because not everybody's seeing them that way. Again, we have the proof right there. if there was one person on the planet that everybody fell in love with, well, good luck. I mean, right? You know, we'd all be after the same person, and that person would be totally tormented because everybody was. So we know that we have different attractions, we have different things that, again, we see all of that, we make that who that person is, and we're quite content with that to some degree. But the pain of attachment is the fact that we do have to separate from those things, that things change. And even that person that you fall deeply in love with and you want in your life doesn't stay the same. And oftentimes when you have that initial thing of falling in love with them and all these wonderful things that you see that are really delicious and delightful, is that even within weeks you might find things about them that turn you off completely because you had a view of them that was not in line with those unfavorable characteristics. You know, you thought that their breath was going to smell wonderful, and then when you kind of get a little closer to them, you find that it's not there. So then you become a little, like it takes it down a notch, and then, you find out that they snore or something, and then you take it down another notch, and then, you keep taking it down a notch, and eventually you keep building up over here all the things you find unpleasant about them. And then you start going to this mind, which is the mind of aversion and anger and hatred. You can turn these very quickly, somebody who was perfect for you into somebody who's the worst thing for you. And we do that also with other objects of desire, maybe not as easily. But the mind of attachment, as well as this mind of aversion, are in total contradiction to how things actually exist. At the level of simply their conventional existence, that they don't have all those qualities kind of there to the degree that we think that they do. Because the mind over here is also exaggerating the negative qualities, taking them way beyond what is there, what is appearing to us. We make it into the whole story of that. So we're doing that irregardless of what's actually there. So we're not in line with reality at all. But we're not even in line with reality at the deepest level. And the deepest level is a bit of where we need to go. I said last night that I wasn't going to talk about the wisdom of emptiness so much, but we'll actually talk about that a little bit tonight as one of the things we can maybe play with in regard to working with our fear. We would say all of our fears are coming from, at these level, I'm going to talk about ignorance in a moment, but these two emotions that are wreaking havoc with our minds, our attachment, wanting things that we find delicious and delightful and comfortable and amenable to just life going our way, getting attached to that, and then what happens in the opposite when things don't go our way, when attachment doesn't get what it wants, when we have negative experiences in our life. These two are where I think fear is primarily coming from, at least at the most kind of immediate level, because we are having the mind that is quite attached to the status quo, to everything being the way it's going, to not having that interruption in our feeling good about things, our having a good life, everything kind of flowing the way we want it to. So we like that and hold on to that, and the fear is about the anticipation of the future pain of not having that continue in the way that we'd like it to, because we start seeing signs that it isn't going to continue that way, which is due to the uncertainty, due to the fact that we can't count on all of those things. This is the fundamental problem with what the Buddha calls samsara. Samsara being this state of being under the control of these delusions, these afflictions, these distorted states of mind, and going from life to life and continuing to suffer and find things unsatisfactory. It's simply part of the whole process. So again, when we talk about these delusions, we come to understand that they are really behind pretty much all of our suffering. The deepest thing, though, that's underneath them is what we would call our fundamental ignorance. And this fundamental ignorance isn't really even understanding how things exist in terms of their identity, much less their qualities. This is a bit harder one for us to get, a bit harder for us to work with to some degree, because it does require a lot of study, a lot of meditation, and if you haven't heard teachings on emptiness, it's a pretty profound subject. But essentially what it means is that we are buying into reality, thinking that things are real in a way that is contrary to how they actually exist. Because whatever sort of qualities of reality that we give them, thinking there's a real flower out here that's established from the side of this stem and all the various parts of it and so on, that somehow a flower exists out here. The Buddha says that actually flower doesn't exist on its own out here. flower in the end is simply a designation that we give to this collection of stuff. It's coming, the power of that is coming from our minds. We all agree to call this, flower. And of course there's it starts with an A. I can't think of the name of it right now. Do you remember the name of this flower?
I know.
Anyway. Pardon?
Freesia?
No, I don't think it's freesia. Anyway. Let's say we happen to have a rose here, okay?
Sounds good.
I love Tibetan Buddhism because when in doubt, you can just imagine, and visualize. So I'm going to visualize a beautiful rose here. What color should the rose be, anyway?
Pink.
Pink, okay. Beautiful pink rose, okay. So if you imagine a pink rose here, the idea, though, is that that pink rose is simply designated to the stuff that appears as a pink rose to us. We all learn those labels. We learn to think of things in particular ways when we're quite young. So we learn what rose is, and we learn what, alarm clock is, and we learn what paper is, and what cushion is, and what light is, and what people are. And we label our whole world because we need to label our world. We need to organize things. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, when he was talking in the retreat that some of you in the room were at the retreat in North Carolina, he says we kind of have a three-part process in terms of how this ignorance takes root. First, we do label things. Something appears to us, and we kind of learn the idea for it. But even before we learn the name of it, because it's not solely naming things, not solely giving names to that object, such as calling that basis a rose, those words, rose, those letters and so on. Rather, it's the idea of it, the conceptualization of it. Because even somebody who doesn't have the language for rose is probably going to conceptualize something about that. Even babies who don't have language conceptualize around their world that they live in to some degree, or they couldn't relate to it. They couldn't scream to be fed, or whatever the case might be. So the idea behind this is that we are going through a process of initially labeling that basis. So that basis appears to us, and in some cases we are labeling it with language. We learn the word rose, and we put that label on that object. The second step is that because we've been under the control of this ignorance forever, because our minds go back without any beginning, it appears to be a rose from its own side. It's like the label rose seems to absorb into that basis. So that rose seems that it's out here on its own, independent of me, independent of my thinking. Even though just the moment before I labeled it, in that moment it already seems to be from the side of the object. And that appearance, again, isn't something happening out here, it's happening in our own minds because we've sort of poisoned our minds to have those kinds of thoughts. So therefore things appear that way. So that appearance comes, that's the second step that Lama Zopa frequently talks about. And then the third step is that we agree with that. We think, oh yeah, rose is out here. Rose is established over here. Now again, I'm not pointing out rose as an example that we should all get very excited about, because frequently, unless it's a beautiful rose that somebody gives us out of some sort of emotion or something, maybe we don't get that attached to it. We understand that roses are impermanent, that they're going to fade away, that they're not going to last forever, and so maybe we don't have that much attachment to a rose. But where we get into the most trouble is in the I, the person that is relating to all of these objects. Because we think that we exist, this word inherently, meaning from our own side, from the side of this stuff that's here on the cushion. So each of you have a mind and a body on this cushion or chair that you're sitting on. And I'm not going to go into all the detailed ways of learning about emptiness and exploring emptiness, but essentially it involves coming to understand how that I seems to exist. It seems real. It seems to exist somewhere in a real, findable way on this collection of stuff. You feel like you're real. And I use that word because Rinpoche uses that word frequently. I'm not saying when we negate that sense of a real I that there's no reality at all. Because there is still reality. You're still in the room. You can say you're in the room. No problem there. Conventionally, you're in the room. But ultimately, are you in the room? When we investigate deeper, is there a real I that is each of you here in this room with us? And what the Buddha says is if we do that investigation, we don't find anything that is the real I. The real I isn't the body or some part of the body. The real I isn't the mind or some part of the mind. And the Buddha would say that's pretty much the collection of stuff that we could think of as an I. in that way a real I. But we also can say there's nothing that is different than those that's the real I. And that's because any of us, we can say, well, do we have a sense that I am sitting outside of this room right now? No. Why? Because your mind and body are in this room right now. So there's a strong sense of an I that we feel really deeply with regard to this collection of stuff. We don't feel it as totally separate. Nonetheless, that's a good thing to kind of consider. When we do this investigation, we come to a conclusion that is emptiness, that is essentially saying that real I that I thought was here, that is guiding my life, that is causing me to be attached and causing me to have aversion and anger, that is causing me to have fear, isn't really here. This is the most powerful way to kind of work with our fear, is to ask that question, well, who's afraid? Where's the I that is afraid? Now again, that's not going to be the immediate one that we go to. We have to work with other ones. Nonetheless, I'm explaining this in the context of understanding that what's driving the show of the attachment, what's driving the anger and the aversion, and those combining in this way to produce fear, is a mistaken mind of ignorance. A mind that thinks that we exist in a very real way, when in reality that I doesn't exist in that way at all, because that I is only labeled, is only designated. In other words, you think of this collection of stuff as being an I, and that's the only I that exists. Still exists, but the way it exists is really very subtle, very slight. Rinpoche says it's almost as if the I doesn't exist. It's almost as if you don't exist, but you exist nonetheless. You exist really what we call nominally, through name or designation, imputation, labeling. The idea is that once we think of something, and we validly think of something, we can't think of an elephant in the room right now, right? Because there's no basis for an elephant in the room. We don't have the legs and the body and the big ears and the trunk and everything to be able to label an elephant. So we all have to kind of agree that there's a basis to label something. But it's simply labeled, merely labeled, nothing more. So this is just a real, quick way of looking at this. But to begin to understand that this force that's underneath the surface at the deepest level, when I ask that question in the meditation, if with Buddhist training we come to understand that fear is arising on the basis of a lot of external factors, on the basis of a lot of what people are saying to us, or what's happening in society at large, or what we're inheriting from our family and from the past that we've seen that they've inherited, and so on. But we also have a lot of internal factors, including these two states of mind, attachment and anger, or aversion, that are kind of causing us to hold on to things and wanting them to continue to be in that way that we like, and having this anticipation that they're not going to continue in that way, that we're going to have to face pain and difficulty, and we have a strong aversion to that. But where those are rooted in, if we keep asking that question, is because we're holding on to this strong sense of an I, thinking that that I is real and experiencing the real pleasure of that object we're really attached to, or that situation we don't want to change, and the real pain of having to move away from that. The aversion that we would experience on that basis is all a fabrication. It's all built on a fundamental lie, a fundamental mistruth. This is why they're called delusions as well. We frequently call these states of mind either afflictions or afflictive emotions, destructive emotions, disturbing emotions. But this word delusion gets at the fact that, like, to quote Venerable Rabina again, who I love to quote, they're all a big fat lie. And we've been following this big fat lie since beginningless time. And everything the Buddha taught is to help us to realize emptiness, so that we can do away with that lie once and for all and live in truth. Come to understand conventionally how things are true, which means that they do still arise on the basis of the labeling, also on the basis of their parts, also on the basis of the causes and conditions that led to them. So we're not denying that there's a lot of factors involved in things coming into existence, but the final way that they exist is really just through being designated. And ultimately, all things are empty of inherent existence. They can't stand on their own. They don't have any way of establishing their own existence, because that basis that we call a rose can't establish itself as rose from its own side. Rose is a label we give to it, an identity we give to it. But then it seems to set itself up in that way. And then we adhere to that. Again, that threefold process that we're involved in. So if we do that deeper investigation, we see where our fear is coming from is a rather complex process. And what I like about Buddhism is that it gives you many different entry points then, right? Because for some of you, you might go, wow, that emptiness thing sounds great, I'm going to work there. And maybe you have some exposure to this idea already, and it's really useful to work there. For some of you, it's going to be like, well, I don't know, I'm not sure I'm getting that yet, but I can start to see how it's working at the level of attachment and anger, and I can begin to undermine it in that regard. But I can also begin to use other teachings and other ideas that will help to dismantle these fearful thoughts. So any thoughts on what I've said so far? I want to check in with people. Does this emptiness concept make sense if anyone's new to this? I'm not sure. I don't know everyone's background.
Yeah, I don't really understand it.
You don't understand it. Okay. What's your name?
Logan.
Logan. So, let me use an example, because the Buddha used a lot of examples to talk about emptiness. And I like to use this example because to me it's actually one of the more approachable examples, easier for us to understand perhaps. So if you, again, I don't know anyone's dreams in the room, but I know when I dream that I feel like my dreams are pretty real. Do you have that experience, Logan? Like when you're in your dream state, under the influence of your sleep and being in the dream state, what's appearing to you seems quite real. You're kind of going through the actions, even sometimes having emotions arise on the basis of dream things appearing to you, dream people or dream experiences in terms of animals or whatever. You can have many different types of dreams, right? So when you wake up from that dream, you come to understand that the dream objects that you thought were real in your dreaming state aren't real in the way that you thought they were. Okay? They still have some reality because you dreamt them, right? And there's no denying. I can't deny the objects that appear to you in your dream. I can't deny the objects that appear to me in my dream. They still appear. But they don't exist in the way that I think they do at the time when I'm dreaming. So when I'm dreaming, I'm absolutely convinced of their reality. And I might even do violent things in my dream, on the basis of that. Somebody's threatening me in my dream. Maybe I do something to harm them. So that's where, again, our dreams aren't identical because there's no real kind of karmic component to a large degree from those types of actions in our dreams. Whereas if we kill somebody or harm somebody in our real life, our waking life, it's very different. But nonetheless, this dream analogy works well for me because it kind of points out that under the control of the sort of ignorance of sleep, the delusion of sleep, we think the dream objects are real in a way that they aren't. And we come to know that when we wake up. It's kind of interesting that Buddha, the term Buddha means the awakened one. When we wake up from that dream and come to understand that that dream object wasn't real in the way we thought it was. Therefore, all the emotions we had about it were totally unnecessary because it wasn't real in the way that we thought it was. This is a bit of what we're trying to get at with emptiness, is to say that those things, everything that we know appears to us in that way, including ourselves, as being real, just the same way that dream objects appear to be real. And if we begin to understand that they don't exist in the way that they appear, which is what the teachings on emptiness and the analyses that we can do can help us to realize, then we can not feel all the emotions that come around all of the various things we're interacting with in our real life, in our waking life. Because those also are dream-like. We wouldn't say they're absolute dreams. It's not like you wake up from this into some other place and have some different experience, beyond what you've had. The idea is that you come to understand through this analogy that we're simply adhering to things in a way that isn't in line with how they exist. And if you get just that from it, that's good enough. Because it means that then you'll start questioning, kind of, well, am I really getting it? Are things really coming when they appear to me? How real do they appear? And am I reacting to them in a way that is not in alignment with how they actually exist? How things appear and how they exist, the Buddha says, are in contradiction, just like in our dream state. Because how they appear is as if they're real, but how they exist is simply as dream objects. In our waking life, How they appear is as if they're real from their own side, established out there on their own. And how they exist is that they're merely designated, merely imputed, merely thought of by our minds. So maybe that's enough to just get a taste of it. Did that help a little? Logan? Yeah, a little. So, again, I frequently encourage people, particularly if this is a new topic to you, to explore it if you wish, but also recognize this is a pretty complex topic, and we have to hear teachings on this again and again and again. And I'm by no means someone who's realized this. You have to maybe sit in the presence of people like Lama Zopa and other teachers who have realized this, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. This is really the goal of our Buddhist practice, is to get to that place where we can realize this wisdom of emptiness that undermines the whole thing. But right now, any of us in the room, really, we're probably still going to be working with some preliminary steps that help us on that train of thought to eventually get there. And that's okay. Because the Buddha, again, taught many different ways of working with things, because we need to kind of manage the process. You can't go right to that wisdom, I don't think. And it'd be really hard to do that, in my estimation. So it's okay. There's lots of books out there. The one book that I think is good when you feel that you'd like to explore this topic more is the one by the Dalai Lama called How to See Yourself as You Really Are. And some people have read that, maybe? No. It's a really nice book, How to See Yourself as You Really Are. He wrote it with Jeffrey Hopkins, who's a great Buddhist scholar who actually was His Holiness's translator for a number of years. His first translator when he was teaching in the U.S. Do you have a question?
Actually, I just want to make sure that I'm following.
Okay, sure.
So, do you mean that when you attain emptiness or awakening, it's kind of like having a lucid dream, in which
in a sense,
you know you're dreaming, but you're still going with it?
So that's a very good point. What's your name? Kira. So what Kira's saying, this is a really good point. So when somebody realizes that wisdom of emptiness, they kind of get that realization. And by the way, when we talk about this realization, we don't just mean, I've got the right thought. We actually mean a deeper experience that happens in meditation. This is why, again, meditation is also a key component of Buddhist practice. Because we have to get the mind into a very deep state, very stable state, so that we can actually realize emptiness non-conceptually. It's no longer in the realm of our thinking mind. It's an experiential taste of emptiness. So that happens. They say, you practice the path and you eventually get to that point, and you have that direct non-conceptual realization of emptiness. When you come out of that meditation, because in that meditation when you're realizing emptiness, the mind isn't conceptual, so you're just having this kind of bare experience of emptiness. And you come out of that meditation and your conceptual mind begins working again, things appear to you. It's as if you're in a lucid dream. Because at that point, you are seeing everything kind of appearing to you as if it's existing out there on its own, as if it's self-established, as if that rose is existing out here on the basis of that stuff, the petals and the color and the shape and the leaves and the stem and everything else. But you no longer believe it, because you're lucidly dreaming. You're seeing things in a correct way. You're understanding that the appearance is in contrast with how it actually exists. So you stop buying into it. At that level, you're already kind of not going to create any more causes to continue the process of being under the control of that, because you've seen the truth. You've seen that ultimate truth of emptiness. Now, for a Buddha is somebody who's further along the path than that. That first initial direct realization, they say, leads to subsequent realizations where you keep working at removing more and more kind of garbage in our minds. Last night I used this example of our minds being like a glass of water that's been polluted by a lot of dirt. We just put the dirt in the water and we keep stirring it up and we never take the dirt out. And so we just have dirty water for minds. But the dirt is not in the nature of the water. It can be extracted and filtered out, and the purity of the water can return. Well, what we're doing on the path is we keep removing more and more dirt. Through the wisdom of emptiness, you remove a bit more. Then you have another episode where you realize emptiness that way, and you remove even more. Of course, you're also accompanying it with a lot of virtuous practice, accumulating merit, we call it. And that kind of acts as the fuel behind all this. And you're able to keep moving further and further on this continuum towards Buddhahood. And you eventually get to the place where you removed all of the afflictions. They're no longer arising at all. There's not even any seeds for them to arise at all. But you still have these imprints that make everything seem to exist from its own side. What causes you to have kind of that appearance as if they're real. Like in lucid dreaming, where they'll still appear to be real objects, but you're knowing that they're not real at all. So that's the last bit of what the person removes, the person who's intent on Buddhahood. And they remove all of that, and they become a Buddha. Now what is a Buddha? No, well, I don't know if I can speak to that completely, but they say a Buddha is in this space of knowing both of these things at the same time. Completely knows emptiness, and never is parted from that. And knows also everything that is appearing to the minds of beings. Everything that is simply, inexistent because it's established by beings. Because we impute that as rose, and we impute that as table, and we impute all these various things. The Buddha knows the way that we impute things because the Buddha knows all the minds of those beings. So the Buddha is a bit beyond the lucid dreaming state to almost like it's a state of omniscience, a state of all-knowing. No longer having any false appearances, but kind of being fully awakened from the entire process. No longer bound up in any of that. But a Buddha doesn't just sort of hang out in that state at the Buddha bar with all the other Buddhas. Rather, the Buddha, through compassion and having generated that strong connection to other beings, continues to be involved in the world, continues to manifest in ways to benefit others. So that's, in a nutshell, what the whole goal of our Mahayana practice, the practice of becoming a Buddha, is all about. So did that help a little bit? Maybe more of an answer than you wanted. Okay, thanks, Kira. It's Kira?
Kira.
Yeah, thanks, Kira. Okay, so let's go back to fear. That's what we're talking about tonight, right? Somehow I've ended up on emptiness, but that's okay. So we talked about these kind of how these different delusions are playing a role in this. So we have kind of that attachment that wants things to continue in the way that we like them to be, wants it all to be fine and running smoothly, and no longer, having to worry about hurricanes or terrorists or whatever it might be. And then when those things come into our lives, the threat of those, something that threatens the security that we feel over here, the comfort that we feel over here, that's when fear arises. So it's on the basis, I think, really of both of those, in a sense. They sound like they're maybe different objects, but they're really still, that's, again, I think, quite clear when we talk about aversion or anger being attachment, not getting what it wants. So it's the same type of thing. Attachment isn't getting what it wants just in terms of having that be stable, having that be certain, having that be something we can rely upon. So, I don't know. I'm hoping that this is useful to kind of look at it in this way and sort of pick it apart and see that you've got a lot of misconceptions that are involved in this. And you might think again, well, this is normal for everybody to want things to go their way, isn't it? Well, that's problematic simply because of this ignorance that it's being driven by. Because we think there's a real I that needs it to go the way of that real I. We think that there's something substantial that is that I, and therefore this is where the whole process comes from. So at some level, conventionally, we may have some agreement that it's good for things to go in a good way, and even part of the Buddhist path is to acknowledge that we do want things to go in a somewhat good way, because it's hard to practice if we don't have things going in a somewhat good way. But we have to undermine some of the attachment that comes with that through some deeper level of wisdom. Otherwise, it's going to just exacerbate the problem. We're never going to kind of be free from all of it, but rather we might have good conditions while we're here, but we won't really ever have freedom from all the pain, all the difficulty, all the suffering that we have to engage in. So let's talk a little bit about kind of I don't know if I need to talk so much about the effects of fear. I think I'm just going to jump right to the ways that we can begin to work with fear. And I'm going to use some of what His Holiness taught. Let me see once more if there's any questions or comments before I move into that.
One thing like with fear, isn't it also like what we talked about a little bit last night with like things changing, and it's a fear of that. Like we have to realize that things are going to change.
And I think
we have to accept
absolutely.
that.
And that's one of the antidotes that we can begin to apply, absolutely, is kind of an acceptance that things don't stay the same, that things do change. And if we have that acceptance, it can frequently already undermine this building up of fear. Maybe we can't get rid of it completely, but at least we don't have the expectation that things aren't going to change. Expectations are also part of this, which we talked about as well. You know, we put an awful lot of that conceptual framework on things, thinking that there's nothing wrong with expecting that everything's going to continue to go the way that it has. Like I said, I think that was a big part of why 9/11 was so shocking for Americans, at least, and even beyond America to other parts of the world, is because we all thought things were going to continue going in a perfectly normal vein. You know, everybody wake up every day and not have that sort of word be something that's bouncing around their heads. You know, terrorism and so on. So things do change, but change is the norm. Change is happening all the time. We're changing all the time. Others are changing all the time. The world around us is changing all the time. This is where I was pointing out last night that we have both that subtle impermanence, which means that things are constantly in flux, as well as the grosser levels of impermanence, which means that things do go out of existence. You know, people die, things happen, buildings come down, whatever. All of this is indicative of not just that grosser level of impermanence, but the fact that things change at all, that they're constantly, you know, in that direction. Anything that's conditioned, anything that arises from causes and conditions, changes moment by moment.
That's when you accept that makes it less fearful, at least for me.
Absolutely, absolutely. There was one teacher, did I mention this the other night? I can't remember what I mentioned where when I get out on these teaching tours, because it seems like I was just in Missoula and now I'm here. So anyway, there was a teacher I had in San Francisco, Malwan Chotak, and he said that he traveled with a friend in Europe, and he would talk about everything in the past tense. Like, oh, this was a really good watch I had, you know, and this was a really good book. I mean, so he was talking about things in the past tense with an acceptance, so trying to get that through his head, that he wasn't going to always have those things. It's kind of a, you know, it's a weird way. I mean, like if you did that in public, people would probably like, well, you're still here, I'm not sure. But it's a useful way to kind of gear our minds to have that understanding that everything we have in our lives is going to go out of our lives at some point or another. Either it's going to go out of existence before we do, or we're going to go out of existence before it does. And that's a really hard truth to face. And there is that sort of fundamental fear of annihilation that's underneath a lot of this, you know, of us going out of existence. Why is there so much fear of terrorism and hurricanes and all that? I mean, it's not just because you can have, you know, things that you have to deal with in the moment and that pain in the moment. It's the fact that people go out of existence into this, you know, they're no longer here. And that's really a bit shocking for us, but the reality is people go out of existence all the time, and we're all going to go out of existence. And death and impermanence is one of the first meditations we do on the path, because it alerts us to that reality that we do need to accept. And so fear of death, and this is where I'm going to start to move into the direction of talking about how we work with fear, depending on whether it is a realistic fear or whether it is an irrational fear. I found it quite interesting in doing the research for this set of teachings, because I taught this actually in Missoula as well. I found that I've never studied psychology, and Sigmund Freud apparently in 1917 distinguished two types of fears, and he called one real fear, and this is a description, a rational and comprehensible response to the perception of clear and present danger. Of course, that's a bit highfalutin, but we're just simply talking about something that we can say is rational. It's a wholesome fear, even, if you will, because if that's going on, it's good to address it, to do something about it, if we can. But there's a whole nother layer of what we would call, in Sigmund Freud's terms, neurotic fear. So this is free-floating, anxious expectation to any something, or perhaps even nothing that catches the eye or the ear. You know, anything that we can, you know, that our minds entertain as a possibility that could be neurotic, could simply be, you know, building things that aren't there, that we just imagine through our own crazy minds. So real fear invites us to action, whereas this sort of neurotic fear induces generally some form of paralysis, or perhaps, behavior that really isn't logical, that isn't consistent with that. So I think it's important that we identify which of these two it is and come to understand that there's something we can actually gain from a wholesome sense of fear. So going back to what I was saying in response to Stacy's question, the Buddhist path that's in this tradition, I'll introduce that really briefly too. It's divided into 3 levels. Did I do this the other night as well?
No.
Okay. No. It's divided into 3 levels. We call it the stages of the path. And the very first level is where we kind of have the movement away from our attachment to this life and the comforts of this life and begin to look at our future life. Again, Buddhism based on this idea that our minds have this continuity, always giving rise to another moment of mind. When this life ends, mind is going to still keep arising. It's a non-material phenomenon. It isn't this body. When this body ceases, mind will keep going on and will attach to another body in our next existence, and we will go through that process of that life and so on. Never ends. There's no end to our mind at all. So the very first step of the stages of the path is to say, well, what happens after this life? And shouldn't I be fearful of a state that could be a lot worse than what I currently have? They say in the teachings that we all have a really ideal life right now because we're born human. And if we even just look at the states of existence, in this world, which are human life and what we would call animal life including everything that is sentient, has, a way of experiencing the world and knowing the world, feelings and so on. And then, that includes all of the animals that are non-human, and then there are human beings. Well, human beings have a whole lot more capability than animals do, right? I could be giving this teaching to Anapala's 2 dogs, right? I could be sitting down with them and say, okay, Pema, okay, Fred, this is what goes on with fear, and da-da-da. They're going to look at me and just want to be petted or get a treat or something. I mean, they're not going to get any of the teaching at all, right? Might plant some seeds, they say, for some future life. But as a dog, they aren't going to be able to do anything with those teachings. So we have a really perfect basis to be able to use these teachings because we can start working with them and make different choices about what we're going to think, how we're going to look at things, how we're going to investigate and see if things really exist in the way that we think they do, all these deeper teachings. Whereas animals can't do that. And the Buddha goes on to say there are many other existences where they can't do that and where they have even more pain and suffering than we have in this world. We won't need to get into those, but that's the first level of the path, is to say, guess what? We should develop some wholesome fear of this life coming to an end without us having put into place the causes that will help us to continue this process in our next life. Because I would like to think that we can all achieve the whole path in a single lifetime. The Buddha does say that's possible. But for most of us, it's probably not as likely. We're probably going to need to continue to have good human rebirths with good conditions, with access to these teachings that help us to continue to develop our minds. Just part of the process. So there is a wholesome fear involved right from the beginning. Actually, Lama Zopa wrote a book that they ended up calling Wholesome Fear, that's about death and waking up to that reality and really embracing death so that we get to the point of our death, which can happen at any time, and we actually have no fear because we've got the assurance that we've done what we needed to do to prepare for that moment and for what comes after that moment. So this sort of fear that is arising then for most people, that is also a fear of uncertainty and the fear of separating from everything that we've gotten quite attached to in our lives. We want to be free of that when we get to the end of this life. So that's what a lot of the teachings at the very first level are about. The second level is where we still are focused on our own situation, but we acknowledge that there's a bigger process we're involved in. And that was what I was explaining earlier, that we're under the control of these delusions. And we keep going from life to life. That process just keeps unfolding because we haven't addressed the causes of that, which are in our own minds. The ignorance, the attachment, the aversion, and all the other stuff that's built on it, as well as our karma that keep perpetuating this process. So, at the second level, we're encouraged to develop a healthy fear of that. Like, we've been there, done that for way too long. We've been in samsara. We just keep going from life to life. Isn't it about time we put an end to it once and for all? Because even as a human, we know that that's an ideal place to be, or way to be born. It's not ideal in many other ways. It's still a lot of suffering, still a lot of pain, a lot of difficulty. Ask anybody in the room, right? You all can attest to your own level of suffering and dissatisfaction you've experienced in the human life even. So the second level is also based on some level of fear. But it's a wholesome fear. It's like, okay, I need to pay attention here and do something positive in response to that not wanting to experience the future pain of going from life to life. So, as I said, the first two then are really about our own situation. The third level is this motivation of bodhicitta that we're working with. That's really what's driving your desire to go beyond your own freedom from suffering and to become a Buddha. To say, okay, I'm going to help all beings to get free from that in the same way that I want to be free from that. So there's some fear even involved there, because we almost universalize our fear, and it pains us to think that any being is going to have to experience difficulty and suffering. We fear the suffering that others will have to experience, or have some dread or apprehension about that. And there's another way we can look at that, but I'm not going to go there. But the point I'm trying to make is that there are really wholesome ways of working with some of our fears that actually could spur us on in our spiritual practice. So if you have fear of death as one thing that you have in your life, maybe you have, most of us do to some degree, maybe we don't think about death frequently enough to have fear of it, but it can sometimes come up, particularly if we've lost somebody very close to us, or simply these types of events that go on in the world where a number of people die and we start feeling that kind of terror of what's going to happen when I have to die. That's a really useful fear, because it should be triggering us to say, well, what do I need to do now to prepare for that? What do I need to do to make sure that when that moment arrives, I do feel some confidence that I can go forward, knowing that I've done everything I could in this life to make sure that this is part of a good process that keeps me moving in the right direction. And if you have a different belief about what happens after this life, I think it's still somewhat the same. It's like, you still want to die with a peaceful mind. If you're going to go to heaven, or you're going to whatever you believe happens after this life, I think it's still an important thing, because we can recognize, if we've seen other people die in the world, how difficult it can be for some people to separate from this life. Yeah, Karen?
But what if your fear is that you'll never be able to attain that satisfaction before you die, not death itself?
The satisfaction of...
That you never kind of feel comfortable because you think that you'll never attain that level of...
Yeah, okay, I see what you mean. Well, but I think, again, we can look at that fear and maybe say, is there something we can do about that fear? And I think there is, because if we actually put the effort into doing what needs to be done to prepare, rather than continuing to be fearful that we're not going to be prepared, or that we're, you know what I'm saying? It's a bit of a choice that we're making there too, to buy into a fear that is paralyzing us and not allowing us to put the energy into actually preparing. So we actually prepare and we do the best that we can, and sure, we don't know. I mean, your death may come before you feel fully prepared for death, but at least you've done the work that you did. This is where there's another really useful quote that I'll share from Master Shantideva, who I've shared from a couple of times during my teachings here. Master Shantideva has a beautiful text called The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. And in the 6th chapter, he deals with the issue of patience and kind of how we can not get so angry at things that are happening in our lives. And I think this is equally applicable to fear. When we look at how do we keep fear from becoming something really problematic for us. And I'm going to paraphrase what he says on the basis of this word fear. He would say, and this is I think the 10th verse of chapter 6, what use is there in being fearful if this is something that can be remedied? What use is there in being fearful if it is something that cannot be remedied? There's a lot of wisdom there, because what he's essentially saying is, if we look at, and I think what we're talking about with your question, Kira, is something that falls in the first category. Well, what's the use of being fearful about whether I'm going to be prepared enough by doing the work in this life to meet death? Rather, I should put my energy into doing something that's along the lines of that, and just making the effort and recognizing that if I keep putting the effort in, as long as I'm still here, I'm going to keep getting better and better prepared for my death. that fear actually isn't the most logical thing to do, that actually we should be able to funnel that into doing something. On the other hand, if you simply have a fear of death, that's just about, well, death is going to happen. I fear that it's going to happen. None of the thoughts that you're talking about. Well, can you do anything about death? You know, nobody in this world, in the history of this world, has ever been able to keep death at bay, right? If they ever figured it out, they didn't share it with anybody, you know. So there is nobody who doesn't have to deal with that. Everyone has to deal with that. So if you simply had a fear of death, is death something that is worth being fearful about? No, because we're all going to have to experience it. It's a reality. Now, all the other fear that might come up around that, or the fear of separating from the people that I love, and the fear of this and that, those fall into the first category again, because I can do something about that. I can lessen my attachment to everything I have in my life, so that when I have to separate from all of that, it's not going to be so painful. But you can't do anything to stop the separation. The separation is going to happen. Death is going to happen for every one of us. So if we take that fear, any of the fears that we work with, we can pick them apart that way too and begin to examine them. Is this something that is fear of something that is absolute, that is going to happen and that I can't do anything about? Well, then I better put my mind into accepting that and making any decisions that might alleviate some of the other pain on the basis of that reality, that death will come and so on. If it is something I can do something about, I'm being fearful of something that isn't determined then, that isn't set in stone, well then put your energy into that change. Put your energy into doing what's necessary. Does this make sense?
Mm-hmm. Totally, yes.
And the Buddhist teachings are really quite logical. And in some ways, when I look at them, I'm always like, well, why didn't I see things that way before? Because they seem so logical. We like to think we're logical. I think everyone in the room thinks they're logical to some degree. But we're not very reasonable in how we look at things. We really aren't. We just have to begin to see them in the light of some deeper truth that we've been somewhat blind to. Yeah, Paula?
No, I'm sorry, I was just thinking that it also has to do with kind of this mindset, and we were talking about this with Anapau the other day, that we always tend to believe that change is going to trigger something worse, right? I mean, kind of typically when you're facing whatever situation, you don't think, oh, I don't know, I mean, I crashed my car, now I'm going, that's awesome because I'm going to get a better one. I'm just using a foolish example, right? I mean, you're kind of the immediate thinking is that whatever happened is going to trigger something that is probably going to be worse than the thing that we had before. So now I just had that thing of that for some reason we have some negative tendency.
And that's another expectation that we have that is unrealistic, because it can go that way, but there's nothing definite about it going that way. And nonetheless, even if it goes that way, we tend to see things really quite black and white, good or bad, and there's no real indication that they're absolute in that way. I'll share a little parable that I found on the internet many years ago that I use frequently. It's actually called a Taoist parable or story from Taoism as opposed to Buddhism, but it's very much in line with it. And you may have heard this before. It's of a farmer, and the farmer has a horse, and the horse runs away one day, and then the next door neighbor comes over and says, I'm so sorry to hear, this is so horrible for you, you lost your horse. And the farmer goes, who knows what's good or bad? So he doesn't get moved in any particular direction. Then the next day, the horse comes back with a wild horse that it's found. So now he has two horses. So the neighbor comes over and says, oh, how wonderful, you've got two horses, congratulations. And he's like, who knows what's good or bad? The next day, his son is out there trying to break the wild horse and falls off of it and breaks his leg. The neighbor comes over and says, I'm so sorry to hear about your son. He goes, who knows what's good or bad? The next day, the military come through and they're taking all the young men to go off to war for the, emperor or whatever. And his son is left behind because he has a broken leg. So the neighbor comes over and says, how wonderful, your son doesn't have to go off to war. And who knows what's good or bad? He can stop it there anyway. So do we really know what's good or bad? I mean, at some level, our good or badness is being put on stuff without really it's just purely subjective. It's just a label that we're putting on it. Now, again, nonetheless, I think that the difference in Buddhism to some degree is that we want to see everything maybe not as necessarily as good, but at least as useful. So if things happen to us, we can once more learn from them, develop some understanding from them, use that as a platform for deeper growth and development in our own minds and hearts. And let me talk, I'm running out of time, and I do want to touch on a few of the ways that His Holiness encourages us to work with this. He was actually asked the question once, how can one work with deep fears most effectively? The very first thing that he talked about, he says there are quite a number of methods. The first is to think about actions and their effects, karma. So let me I'll read what he says and then we'll talk about this. Usually when something bad happens, we say, oh, very unlucky. And when something good happens, we say, oh, very lucky. Actually, these two words, lucky and unlucky, are insufficient. There must be some reason. Because of a reason, a certain time became lucky or unlucky. But usually we don't go beyond that. The reason, according to the Buddhist explanation, is our past karma. So anything that is ripening into our lives that is a potential threat on the horizon, when we're talking about fear, something that we think is out there that could be happening, well, it's karmically influenced. It's not something that is sort of lucky or unlucky from its own side. It's something that is actually a product of our own past actions. So we have those things that happen and those things that come into our lives, and we need to learn from them again. This is something I've emphasized in the last few teachings. So His Holiness goes on to say, one way to work with deep fears then is to think that the fear comes as a result of your own actions in the past. Further, if you have fear of some particular pain or suffering, you should examine, as I was saying, whether there is anything you can do about it. If you can, there's no need to worry about it. If you cannot do anything, then there's also no need to worry about it. So if we say, okay, we are works in process and we're influenced by all we've done in the past and those are what's coming into our mind right now, we have to understand the mechanism by which that's all coming into our lives, learn from that so that we dismantle that process and stop creating the same things again and again. Again, that insanity that we're talking about, that quote, that doing the same thing over and over again and somehow expecting different results. Well, you're going to keep getting the same result if you keep doing the same thing. Okay, so that's one understanding we can bring to fear that he says is really useful. The other one I've touched on to some degree. Another technique is to investigate who is becoming afraid. Examine the nature of yourself. Where is this I? Who is I? What is the nature of I? Is there an I that exists besides my physical body and my consciousness? And he said this may help. And again, we have to have more instruction in that. Just that little bit of advice from His Holiness isn't enough to, do the deeper work of investigating the wisdom of emptiness. But this is the way to undermine the whole process. But the third one I think is really important to share here, because once more we are aiming for, most of us in the room have some desire to move towards the third level of the path, to really be focused on the welfare of all beings, to not just think about my own suffering and my own fears, but to embrace all beings in all of their suffering and dissatisfaction, all of their fears. So he says here, also someone who is engaging in the bodhisattva practices seeks to take other suffering onto himself or herself. When you have fear, you can think, others have fear similar to this. May I take upon myself all of their fears. This is a really courageous mind. This is why this path of the bodhisattva, the being who's intent upon developing that third level, they also cultivate the first and the second as a preliminary. But they need to get to that third level of having this really courageous mind of bodhicitta that is like, I'm going to do whatever it takes, even if it's by myself alone, to free all beings from suffering and place them all in happiness. And the Buddha, Dalai Lama, maybe same thing, who knows. The Dalai Lama says that this is actually how we're wisely selfish, how we actually meet our deepest needs and achieve our greatest potential is by being focused on the welfare of others. Your greatest happiness will come when you have others as the main object of what you are doing and how you are motivated. And we know this a little bit to some degree. I mean, every one of us has the experience of one time or another in our lives when we were focused on the welfare of another being. Maybe it was a sick child, and maybe it was an animal that was, unwell or in some stress. Maybe it was, just a stranger on the street that we felt we needed to help because where they were at and what was going on for them. When we set aside ourselves and are genuinely with that other being, with the aim of alleviating whatever suffering is going on for them, helping them in whatever way that we can, it's a totally transformative experience. And frequently we come out of that really feeling some deep sense of well-being because we have done that process of setting ourselves aside and being genuinely with others. Well, this technique that His Holiness is referring to is part of what we call Tonglen. Tonglen is a Tibetan Buddhist practice. Tong meaning to give, Len meaning to take, but we usually practice it in the other direction. We take away suffering first, and we give happiness. So what he's encouraging us to do is when you have those moments of fear, when you're sitting there thinking, wow, I'll bring that up one more time, like the Las Vegas concert, right? Maybe many of you in the room go to group concerts like that might be outdoors or somewhere, and the next time you do that, you might even have that fear before you go of, what if something like that happens again? What if there's another person who's that deluded that would do something like that? Well, think about the fact that this is universal, that other beings have that same fear. At some level, all beings have some fear of death, long until they've dealt with that in a healthier way. Have some fear of the pain that could be experienced from losing someone or whatever might be involved in that. Try to universalize that. Don't think about it just being your own little bubble of fear, and try to take that on. What is it like to take all their fear away? And even you can just simply have the thought, through my having to be fearful and deal with this pain that I'm anticipating or having some trepidation around, through my having to deal with that, may others not have to deal with it. May everyone else be free of it. That's a really powerful thought. That's a bodhisattva thought already. But just even if you can, to visualize taking that away from them, they sometimes say you sort of take it away from them in the form of something kind of negative, like a black smoke or something, and you can even breathe it in down to your heart and feel that it kind of destroys all that self-centeredness that is an obstacle to really being genuinely there for others. And then the giving part of it is where we think all the things that we have that bring us happiness, the people in our lives, the resources we have, even all the positive karma we've created in this life and other lives. We give all that away. It becomes like this source of light and love for other beings, and they instantly get whatever they need. Not just to alleviate their fears, but to bring them to, states of well-being and bliss. So you can learn more about Tonglen. A really wonderful teacher on Tonglen is Pema Chodron, who I've mentioned a number of times before, but Lama Zopa Rinpoche teaches on Tonglen and Ultimate Healing, a really wonderful book about medicine Buddha and other practices. He teaches about it, and I'm sure other texts, I can't think of them at the moment. But just know that there are many resources, and Tonglen can be practiced in a lot of different ways. So you might read Pema Chodron's and then you read Rinpoche's and they seem like they're not quite the same. Well, that's perfectly fine. Any of these practices that work with taking away suffering and giving away our happiness, which is the opposite is what we normally do, right? We'd be happy to give away our suffering. Like, oh, I really wish someone else had this headache. And we also are very reluctant to give away our happiness. Thank you very much. I'll keep it for myself. As we see karmically, even the causes of our happiness are actually through giving, through actually being very generous with that. And the causes of our eventual freedom from suffering are by being willing to take on the suffering of others. So if you're at all interested in this practice, again, I would encourage you to do some research, some looking around, but lots of teachings out there. And by the way, there's some free books that Namdrol Ling has out there, but know that those come from a part of our organization that's called the Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archives. And there's a whole store of teachings that's amazing out there. It's basically lamayeshe.com, and if you pick up one of the books, you'll see the address in there, the web address. And just go there, and you can put in a number of topics, and you get different articles, different teachings from Lama Zopa, from Lama Yeshe, who was our founder, as well as many other teachers in this tradition. And so just know that there's lots of resources that might take you further than what we've been able to cover here tonight. I actually did this talk in 2 sessions at the Vipassana group because it's a pretty meaty topic. But Any final questions or comments on what we've talked about? So know that again, just to recap, this fear is arising. We can see it as something that we can actually use that could be quite rational and reasonable. Some of our neurotic fears might be in that category of not really being worthwhile to invest in because we can't do anything about them. Or they might even be founded on false information, not really be something that we need to follow at all. If we're going to work with fear, though, we can see that there's the technique of remembering the impermanence, that things are changing and uncertain, that we can't really rely upon that. The karma, which was again what His Holiness brought up, that this is a product of our past actions, so let's learn from it and do something different. The other one of the emptiness of the self, which again might require some deeper investigation. And then finally this bodhicitta practice, this willingness to take on others' fears when we feel our own fear arising. His Holiness says, when you have fear, just to finish off his comment on that Tonglen practice, when you have fear, you can think others have fear similar to this. May I take to myself all of their fears? Even though you are opening yourself to greater suffering, taking greater suffering to yourself, your fear will lessen. Anyway, I was going to share something else, but I think that's good enough. So if there's no other questions or comments, let's go ahead and do the last prayers that we have. Again. Okay. Everyone still has the prayers handy? So let's go to the first page there at the bottom. And maybe tonight we can say the long life prayers for the teachers. It's just a couple minutes after 9:30. I certainly understand if people absolutely need to leave, but we're just going to do the prayer at the bottom of the first page, then we're going to continue on the second page. And these first two prayers are really what we call our traditional dedication prayers. We'll just recite these in English, but we have these thoughts that what we've done here tonight, whatever seeds we planted, whatever ideas that have started to take root in our minds that are positive and beneficial, may all of that bring the best possible result. In Buddhist terms, that possible result is bringing all beings to enlightenment, having that state where we're all in Buddhahood. And then the second prayer that we're going to recite at the top of the next page is about bodhicitta. And we see that this is a really powerful mind. I mean, I don't know all world religions or traditions, faiths, spiritual practices, but I've never come across anything like bodhicitta. I mean, bodhicitta is really so far-reaching. It's comparable really to, I think, kind of like Christ-like mind, Christ's mind of wanting to take on the sins of all beings through his crucifixion. It's a bit of that idea, but the idea is that we can do that. This isn't just the domain of Christ and other people who are, or beings who are in another dimension, but this is something we all can do, is really generate that heartfelt wish to help all beings to be free from all their suffering, and we want that mind to grow and develop in our own hearts and in the hearts of others. So let's say these two prayers with those thoughts in mind. Due to this virtue, may I quickly become a Guru Buddha and lead all transmigratory beings without exception to that state. May the precious Supreme Bodhicitta, not yet born, arise. May that arisen not decline, but increase more and more. So now we're going to say these prayers for our teachers, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and make wishes that all of his desires come into fruition. His Holiness's desires for all the beings of this world to have happiness and peace and so on. And then on the next page, that final page, Lama Zopa, who's our spiritual director, and then Osohita, who is the reincarnation of Lama Yeshe, who was our founder. So we're just going to say these with strong intention for all of our spiritual guides to have good health and long lives. Even spiritual guides in other traditions to have that. If they are helping others to find peace and happiness in this world, we want them to continue to be here and to be in the lives of all beings. So let's make those strong prayers with those sorts of thoughts behind them. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Savior of the land of snow teachings and transmigratory beings, who extensively clarifies the path that unifies emptiness and compassion, To the lotus holder, Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three sublime ones, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors, for those wanderers in far-off places, especially in the West, mindful of your loving concern for us, in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. Lama, please, please live long. So the last thoughts that we want to have are around those beings whose suffering moves us at this time. So we can think in general ways about, groups of people or places in the world where there's great suffering. For example, the people in Puerto Rico who are dealing with really difficult conditions now, and people dying because of those. As well as anywhere else where there is harm to the elements that are threatening the lives of both humans and animals in this world. We can think about other places where there is war and so on, but we can also bring to mind individuals who we know, whose situation is difficult. They might have obstacles to their well-being, they might be dealing with illness, or perhaps they are beings who are dying or who have died recently. Make strong prayers and kind of send this positive energy out, a bit like the Tonglen practice with giving. So to send all the positive energy that you've created, seeing it as inexhaustible. It's not something that we completely give away in a sense, rather it becomes very dynamic. And we're sending this out in all directions, especially to those beings whose situation moves us. And think that by virtue of our sharing that with them, their suffering is relieved. And they attain true peace and happiness. And think that this happens for all beings through our efforts here tonight. None of it wasted, all of it bringing forth the best possible result. Okay, thank you all so much, and I really enjoyed my time here.
Thank you.
Sorry it's come to an end.
Thank you.
But anyway, hopefully return next year.
Yes.